I've been working on a new back door for the shop here at Black Bear Forge. This door has an opening shutter on the upper end, and the door that it is inspired from had a very simple iron grill in that opening. So that's what I'm going to be working on today. This is starting with some 1/4 by 3/8 material. This is something a little unusual I don't normally keep around, but it's what fits the woodwork for the door. Anything larger would look out of place and might interfere with the operation of that shutter. It's going to be fairly simple, but I don't want it to look like it just came out of the steel mill, so I'm going to knock the corners off of it, give it just a little bit of texture, but not a lot. And of course then they need to be straightened because this thin stuff really bends and bows and gets wobbles in it when you do that. And then real early on I want to drill these screw holes because they're going to be hard to access later. Once I get bars in this, I won't be able to get back in and put this under the drill press easily. So I'll drill and countersink all these screw holes for a number 6 flathead screw. We'll probably look at 4 different welding techniques during this video. This frame I'm just going to weld up simply with the MIG gun and just get the frame established so that I can take it back into the wood shop and see how the frame fits before I go any further. This is where that grate is going to go. This has to fit in this opening, and I want to make sure this fits before I go any further. The other thing I want to make sure is that I drill all my pilot holes for mounting this in this doorway before I get the bars in. It's going to be hard enough to drive the screws when there's a bar right here, but I want to make sure I drill the pilot hole so I can drill straight through, and that'll make everything easier when the final installation happens. These self-centering drill bits are great for this. Now that we know the frame fits the way that I want it to, it's time to do some of the decorative elements. I'm going to do a reverse twist on the 2 outer bars that this grill gets. Well, you can see how this vise slips. I'm really kind of getting tired of it. Paid a lot of money for this vise, and it may be the worst holding vise that I have ever used. But with a little perseverance, we can get this twist done. I like the sharper corners in the twist, but the straight bar, I want to knock the corners down. And again, get rid of that factory appearance. And I did the same thing to both ends of both of those outer bars. The central element will be a forge welded element made up of some 1/4 inch square bars that are tapered out to do the heart-shaped scrolls, and this will all be forge welded together, but I need 4 identical tapers in 1/4 inch square bars. Really pretty quick and straightforward. All the inner components are 3/8 squares, so they're the same size as the width of that 1/4 by 3/8 frame. So I'm scarfing the 3/8 square bar. Just put a simple little tack weld on 2 1/4 inch bars in preparation for forge welding those together. I'm going to do this in the induction forge. The induction forge is one of my favorite ways to do these small welds. Very precise heat, plenty of heat. You can't actually burn stuff up in the induction forge, so you have to be careful. But it's very exacting. Doing this in a coal forge, you end up with more heat. It's a little harder to see the color of the material, more likely to contaminate the weld with coal dust, ash, things like that. So the induction forge has turned out to be a great way to do these small forge welds. And of course I'll scarf the end of that bar. Typically when you do a weld of this sort, you have to bring both pieces out, line them up at the anvil, drop the tongs, pick up the hammer, and make the weld. That's referred to as a drop tongs weld. It's another advantage I have working in the induction forge, because I can come in from both sides of the coil, assuming your decorative element will fit through the coil after you're done with this. If it's not going to fit back in, this may not work so well. But because I can come in from both sides of the coil, I can line this joint up in the coils, and if I give it a little bit of a squeeze, which looks like it may have gotten edited out of this video, but anyways, I just push them together lightly, I can get kind of a tack weld on there. It's real lightly welded, but it is going to stay, and I can drop the tongs while I'm still heating and go to the anvil, and the pieces are already lined up and stuck together, and then I can make that forge weld. And any forge weld starts with a lighter hammer and light rapid blows to get the weld established. Then you can refine the weld with heavier blows once you've got it established. I will take several heats just to refine the shape of the weld and get all this down so it flows as though it was one bar originally. Yes, you could split the 3/8 bar and you'd get a very similar result, but I think the forge weld looks a little bit better. The 2 1/4 inch bars are of course wider than the 3/8 bar would have been. And to me it just presents a much more pleasing looking element than if I had split those. Of course, as with every other bar in this gate, the parts that haven't been forged some other way are going to get the corners knocked off just for a more attractive appearance. This will also get a forge welded collar at that point of the weld, and this adds a real decorative element to the piece. The collars are just made out of 1/2 by 1/8 material, and they're bent entirely cold. I don't need to heat this up to do this. It's just a matter of bending them in the vise at the right place, and then putting a 3/8 spacer in there to get the other bend, and that gives me a nice 3/8 U shape to make the collar out of. But with those ends trimmed and beveled, I can wrap this around right where the weld is and get this where I want it to be. Then I'm going to go back to the induction forge, heat this up, flux it, and then forge weld the collar down. This is not heavily forged after forge welding it. You just want it to be stuck. If it is not 100% perfect forge weld, it's not going to hurt anything. You don't have to refine this like you would if you were welding the cutting edge into an axe or a chisel or something like that. This is just there for looks. You could actually do this entire element probably with a torch weld or TIG weld, something like that, if you don't have a forge that gets up to forge welding heat. But this is a nice, simple little welding project. So if you're just getting into forge welding, this might be something interesting to work on, doing elements of this sort. It doesn't have to be on this same kind of piece, though. I'm going to go ahead and run a decorative chisel line around that, and again, that's just for ornamentation, serves no other purpose. You can do this with a hand chisel at the anvil if you don't have the treadle hammer. I just think the treadle hammer is one of the most convenient tools for doing this kind of work, and it's one of the big tools that I would never want to be without. I would give up the hydraulic press and maybe even the power hammer before I would give up the treadle hammer. Hard to say on the power hammer, though. By holding that collar tight in the vise, I can open this element up and get it prepared for bending the scrolls, which is going to be a fairly slow, tedious process because this cools off so fast, and I want to try and get these even. So I work a little here and a little there. If things start to have flat spots like you can see initially here, I'll need to go back and straighten those out a little bit and try and get the bend more where I want it. So it's a lot of back and forth, and I'm not going to show every little detail, but there's probably a dozen heats involved in this. I have stopped using the induction forge because this element doesn't fit entirely back into the coils. I could probably make a coil that would fit this, but this is just as easy to put in the gas forge at this point. And I've done quite a few things in the last few months that have these little fiddly scrolls on here, getting good use out of these smaller bending forks we made. If you haven't seen that, I'll put a link in the upper corner of the video, and you can see the video on making these small bending forks. But ever since the first hook I did with a similar scroll to this, I have thought about putting that kind of an element on this door. Now I've made two bars that are identical, so this element will be made up of two separate bars, and I'm going to go ahead and tack weld the two elements together so that they stay put while I collar them. And we've looked at doing a little MIG welding, we've looked at doing some forge welding, and now I'm going to do just a little bit of torch welding. In the end, I think most of the more modern welding techniques, TIG welding would probably be the ideal way to do this. But at this very moment, I do not have the capabilities to do any TIG welding, and the torch is probably the next best thing. In some ways, I may like the torch better because I just feel like I've got a lot of control over it. But it heats up an awfully big area and can be a little bit problematic if you need a real concentrated heat. So the ability to TIG weld is something I really want to add in the shop. And spoiler alert, we'll probably get to that before this video's out. Now, these collars are done hot because they're not going to get forge welded. These just shrink into place. Get it hot and give it a nice squeeze so it's as tight as I can get it on here. And as that cools, it will shrink and it will no longer be kind of a loose, wiggly collar. These shrink up nice and tight. And the collar would be enough to hold this. It would just be really hard to get the collars in place with the pieces moving, so that the little tack weld really does make a difference. And here is a machine that will allow me to TIG weld. I have not TIG welded in many, many years and have forgotten most of what I ever knew, so if you're a competent TIG welder, try not to be too critical of this, because this is the first welds on a project I've done in a very long time, and I'm going to need to practice a lot to get better. It does get the job done, and I will resort to some grinding to clean things up because I've got way too much filler rod on some of these. But I can certainly see lots of applications in the future for having a TIG welder in the shop. And we'll do a complete video on that particular machine after I get to know it a little bit better. I am going to heat up all the places where I've done some grinding, give it a good wire brushing. That way the color blends with everything. Ever since Johnson's paste wax went out of business, some people have been making alternative waxes, and this is one that somebody sent me to try out. I think everything that I've tried has been a very good substitute for the Johnson's paste wax. Any of these things that are being made by small blacksmith and fabrication shops for use in blacksmithing are probably a better option anyways, because you're supporting a fellow craftsman that's making this stuff available instead of the big multi-billion-dollar corporation. So I'm glad to be able to use some of these things. Now we've pre-drilled the frame, pre-drilled the door opening, so this is really pretty straightforward to put in. I did mark the frame so I knew which side was up and knew which side was out, to make sure that it went back together exactly the same way it was when I drilled the holes in the door frame. And the top and bottom are easy. You can get a screwdriver in there, no problem. The sides are a little bit weird, and I was lucky to have this little hand ratchet. Might be the first time I've ever used it. It came with some other set of tools, but it's pretty handy for doing this, and it gets the job done. These are slotted screws because I think the slotted screws look better than Phillips or square drive or whatever else you might use, but that's just a personal choice. This grill was a fun project. I enjoyed doing it. It's fairly simple in reality. It just has this one ornamental element in the middle here. The twists don't amount to much, although I do think they add to it. I think I like it better with the twists than if I had left them out. But it's not overly complicated. Now, I think TIG welding was the way to go to do the joinery on this. It's a little bit more precise and accurate than I am with a torch, although with my current skill level at TIG welding, since I haven't done this in a long time, I'm probably about as good with a torch, and I probably could have gotten by just fine using the torch. But if you don't practice this stuff, you never get better, and this is a good way to practice new skills. If you'd like to see the video on building the door itself, that's over on the other channel. I will link to it right down here. And if you'd like to see the video on the hinges that are on the other side of this door, I'll link to that video down here. Meantime, I hope you have time in your day to get out to your shop, make something, stay safe, wear your safety glasses. We'll see you for the next video.